You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast and the Good Question podcast. We have a really cool guest today. Her name is Helene Wecker. She's the author of The Golem and the Jinni, which was a really fantastic book that I read on my own years ago, and then again with my son recently. And her new book is called The Hidden Palace, which is like the sequel to The Golem and the Jinni. And I just wanted to speak to her. I thought it would be so cool to speak to the author of two books that I love. So, Helene, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, because of the subject matter of the books and your name, I don't know, I just assume you're some mysterious foreign woman that lived in, Syria or Azerbaijan or something. Not that it's a disappointment, but it just seems like because of the book's topics and everything that you'd be this very unusual, European or Eastern European lady that was shrouded in mystery. But what's your background? And then I want to ask you, how you came to write these books.
Oh, well, I feel so bad that I'm just a suburban Jewish mom. So my background is I grew up outside Chicago in a little town called Libertyville. Grew up Jewish. I in 80s and 90s, went to public high school, got bat mitzvahed, all of that. Went to Carleton College in Minnesota and got my bachelor's in English and women's studies. And so, was doing very much the liberal arts education, wanted to be a writer sort of my whole life. I'd always written, a lot of it was like bad fanfic, but you got to start somewhere. But at the same time, by the time I got to college, it was like sort of ingrained in me that I needed to have a jobby job, like a job that was going to pay bills, a 9 to 5 with, a briefcase and a 401k. And so when I graduated, I went into marketing and communication and did that for about 7 years. And along the way, as I was, sort of feeling my soul crumble a little bit more every day, because I just, it's a great field, but it wasn't for me. Of the work? It was, in the end, really what it was about was that I was writing press releases about other people's awesome life works. And I wasn't doing my own, work that was going to be what I put out of myself into the world. And yeah, some of it was, corporate drudgery. I mean, one of the first places I worked was a software company that has been since subsumed like 3 times over and is now, some infinitesimal, oh God, I said that horribly, part of Oracle. But now, and I still have friends from that time and whatever, but then I moved to Seattle and worked for a public television station, and I was still just hating my actual, day-to-day job. And that was when it was like, okay, here's a cause that I believe in. Here is something that, I really, public television, like what a great, sort of place to work. It was very friendly. It was, you felt like you were doing something good for society, but it still just wasn't what it wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. So at that point was when I made the decision to get back into writing, and I was very fortuitously laid off from the public television station at around that time, and started writing these short stories that were like the first fiction that I had written in probably, 10 years or so. And it was immediately felt like, this is stuff that I'm writing for like night classes, for like continuing education, intro to creative writing. and immediately felt like this is more rewarding and means more to me than any of the stuff that I've worked on in my actual career in like the last 7 years. So at that point I was like, okay, I need to really, do this for a living, or at least try. I wasn't enough of an idiot to know that, you can just start writing and it becomes your living. I knew what the odds were, but I decided what I wanted to do was go and get my master's. And I'd acquired back at Carleton a boyfriend named Kareem, and he had, I'd moved with him out to Seattle for his career. And then along this, we become more and more serious. So I applied to a bunch of grad schools, got into Columbia, which was just sort of insane to me, and proposed to him in the same weekend. And then we were off, and I moved to New York. And that was the beginning of like my creative writing, sort of like, okay, I'm giving this my all now. I'm going into a decent amount of debt and I'm giving this my all, and I'm going to write. And what happened was you get to a program like Columbia and they say, okay, you're going to, by the time you get out of here, you're going to need to have a body of work that's going to be your thesis. This is what you're going to, on the strength of which you will graduate or not. And that it can be a collection of short stories. It can be part of a novel, but, you need to start thinking about it basically from the day that you get there, because this is like the corpus that you're going to build as you are as you are a student. And I decided what I was going to do was I was going to write this series of connected short stories. Very realist, very, Raymond Carver-esque, nothing that could happen in them that wouldn't happen in real life. And they were going to be about my family history and my husband's family's history. And so, me growing up as Jewish girl in the Chicago suburbs, the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. The fact that, it took me a number of years to realize that not every grandparent had an accent. I thought other people's grandparents were weird because they didn't have accents. I thought, all families came from somewhere else. I thought, it was normal to me that there was this, huge shrouded thing in the family's history that no one really talked about, but everyone knew about. In my case, the Holocaust. And then in Kareem's family's history, being the child of an immigrant and having, growing up during the, Iraq War era as an Arab American kid going to high school and, getting called all sorts of names and having sort of the worst horrors of the Syrian regime in his family's history, as well as, and then, coming together, us meeting at college, and then having these resonances sort of crop up over and over again, specifically around issues of immigration and being the child of an immigrant family, and how it just makes you feel like you're just a little weird. You're always going to be just a little weird. And so I was telling these tales through the family, through the generations, and there was this Jewish girl and Arab American boy who were sort of threading through and meeting up every once in a while. And the problem I started running into was that the stories just weren't good enough. They were not what I wanted them to be. Part of this was because I wasn't, I didn't have my chops yet. I just wasn't a good enough writer yet. But part of it also was that I was telling stories that I knew by heart. I was fictionalizing them a little bit for, just to sort of not just so that it wasn't straight up family memoir, so that it was, actual fiction, but also so that they, sort of hung together a little better, that they formed their own little world. But I knew everything, and so I wasn't discovering anything as I wrote it. And it was like I was telling a story I told a million times before, and that was the energy that it had on the page.
So how did you? So I understand you grew up Jewish, so that part of the culture makes sense. The Syrian part, is that also part of your heritage? Or how did you understand that culture and incorporate it?
I have no, my family is full on Ashkenazi Jewish. And, my dad's parents were from Poland. My mom's parents were from Germany. And there's absolutely no Middle Eastern heritage in my family in that sense. Kareem's family, his dad grew up Sunni Muslim in Syria in a town called Hama. And his mom is actually a Polish Catholic in Chicago, but they met in France in the late 60s. And that was where Kareem's older sister and he were born. And then eventually they came to the U.S. in like the early 70s. And I had really known no Arab Americans growing up that I can think of. And, growing up, it was, Syria was what you heard in the news and they were fighting Israel. So that was the extent of my, Eastern awareness, as a Jewish American girl growing up, identifying with the Jews in the news and sort of getting that, sort of surface level awareness of Middle Eastern politics, and then meeting someone who was actually, connected to, an Arab American family, and had roots in Syria. That was altogether new to me. And so that, it was a very deep learning process for both of us, and a lot of, processing along the way. And, it still is in the way that any relationship like that is, you're still, run up against things sometimes, or you just hit spots in your knowledge where it's like, oh, I don't know anything about this. I had better learn. So what happened from there was that these stories being sort of bad, I'm sitting and talking to a friend of mine who was in the workshop, and I was just complaining about it. What am I going to do here? These aren't very good, and I want to be a better writer than this. Right. And she said something to me that basically changed the course of my life, which was, Helene, I don't understand why you're writing in this style, in these very realist MFA short stories, when I know you and I know what a nerd you are and what a sci-fi and fantasy fiend you are, and that's all that you read when, you're not reading something for class. That's all you talk about in class when, talk about the fantastical comes up, and that's what you advocate for. So why aren't you writing like that? And okay. I was like, I don't, and to this day, I'm not entirely sure why. I mean, it just made so much sense, and it was like I just needed someone to just sort of slap me upside the head and say, what are you, why are you doing this? Why are you writing at something that isn't your style? And she said, so the next thing I see from you in workshop, it can be about your families, but I want it to be fantastical. And I was like, okay. And I just sort of took it as marching orders because I felt like I needed someone to tell me what to do at that point. And I went back to my apartment and I said, okay, so what if instead of the Jewish girl and the Arab American boy who are in these stories, what if we sort of Neil Gaiman this up? And what if we turn this in, make them into the most emblematic folkloric creature from each culture? What if we made them a girl golem and a boy Jinni? And it was like within the next, I don't know, few hours, I had written the first dozen pages of what would go on to turn into the Golem and the Jinni. And, it was like cool. Every decision that I made like that day just cascaded into this book, this giant book. I did not realize that I was writing. I thought it was just another short story. And I was like, okay, I'll just set it at like the turn of the 20th century because it has this sort of folkloric feel to it. And I'll set it in New York because, where are two creatures like that going to bump into each other? Well, if you were taking this as like an immigration story, then, and coming to America, it's got to be New York because this is, this feels sort of Ellis Island to me, and and so on. And I knew absolutely nothing at that point about life at the turn of the 20th century. I knew, I was like, okay, well, we'll set it, we'll do the Jewish Lower East Side. I didn't even know that Little Syria existed. I had to research that and sort of find out for myself that there was this actual neighborhood called Little Syria, sort of at the southern tip of Manhattan. And
that's what I was going to ask you. Is the time period of the book is right about what, 1900?
Mm-hmm.
And how did you know what was going on during that time period?
A
That's
lot
another
of
thing for you to research.
Oh my goodness. It was just a lot of research. I mean, and luckily at that point I was at Columbia, so I had access to their library and it was like me and the Xerox machine and like going through stacks in the library and finding, you know, the records of neighborhood meetings from 1898 or whatever, where this new neighborhood is forming called Little Syria, and it's full of people from, well, what is now Lebanon. Back then it was part of Greater Syria, and they were all Lebanese Christians, so there were very few Muslims that come over at that time. So that was something I hadn't expected. I was like, okay, well, if I want to be true to the history, which I did, need to learn about Lebanese Christians, which I knew even less about than Syrian Muslims at that point. So it was just a giant education, which, it's just like the logistics of how did someone get an apartment back then? How did you, know what time it was? The rich people had pocket watches, but what about everyone else? How did you, what sort of restaurants were available? What was, just how was life lived in that time from like the street level? What would really trip up an immigrant? And more than that, what would trip up someone who isn't just like new to the city, but new to humanity? Because that these two sort of arrived, by accident. Both of them were not expecting to, arrive in the middle of New York in 1899. And, now they have to blend in and camouflage themselves as humans. So what do they have to learn, and how are they going to adapt? How are they going to pass, basically, as human? And so that took a lot of time to just sort of figure out detail by detail and figure out, okay, what can they do? What can't they do? What's going to be the stuff that, here you've got Golem, which is, a person made of clay. I have it so that she is enough of, she's been built to be someone's wife, so she looks human enough to pass as human. But at the same time, like, she doesn't sleep, she doesn't eat, she has immense strength but she's in a female body in 1899. And, women were even more constrained in what they were allowed to do back then than they are now. So how she's going to run up against a lot of, barriers, and what is really going to throw her for a loop.
Is the personality of Chava or Ahmad, similar to you or your husband?
I think I gave her a lot of my like anxiety, some of my insecurity. I don't know. It's sort of funny, especially, over the number of years that I've been working on these books. I think we've come closer to each other than I would care to admit. But for my husband, he's less Ahmad than I am Chava, I think. Kareem is Ahmad is a very free spirit. And he has to remember to think about other people and to be responsible and to not just sort of wander off and, make trouble. And Kareem can be a very adventurous spirit like that, but he's also one of the more responsible people I've ever met. So there are aspects of that personality, perhaps, but it certainly isn't one-to-one.
And how long did it take you to write the whole book?
From beginning to end was 7 years. Yeah, that was a very long time. And I mean, the first 2 years of grad school, and then after that it was, we moved out here to California, and I spent a lot of time either writing on the sofa or working a very weird series of odd jobs to, pay the bills. But after it must have been a number of years, I had met, and when I was at Columbia, I'd met an agent, and, as just, part of life in the program, being in New York, the professors all, there's like one night when the professors all they've bribed their agents to come and meet us, and everyone gathers in a big room, and it's sort of like a very awkward speed dating sort of a thing, where you walk around the room and pitch your book to agents and collect cards. And I managed to meet and chat with a man named Sam Stoloff, who was intrigued enough by the idea of the book, which at that point was roughly 50 pages long, and I was just collecting business cards, because why the heck not? But we started corresponding, and he would have me send him pages, and I'd send them to him, and he'd send me comments back, and he was very encouraging. And then when the book, this went on for a number of years, and then when the book was about half done, he said, well, I think you've got enough that we can sell it now, so let's clean it up and, take it to auction. I've got some editors that I can put it in front of if you're willing to sign with me. And I was like, heck yes. So the book sold to HarperCollins, and then I had to finish it. So that was a bit of a crazy year, because I also got pregnant a couple months after I sold the book, and we had been trying for a number of years, and so of course both of these very long awaited events happened roughly at the same time, and then it was like a race. So I finished the baby came first, and then I finished the book, and I don't remember much about finishing the book, but then it was published in 2013.
Yeah, the thing that struck me was I don't want to give the book away, but when you talked about Joseph Schallman's past lives, for some reason, I was like, whoa, that concept just blew me away when you described it. Where did that come from?
That was really funny. So, and this might be spoiling part of the book, but what happened was roughly, I'd say 2 or 3 years into the writing process, I didn't know where I was going, really. I had these characters, and I had a rudimentary plot, and I knew I wanted to explore all of these themes and issues, but the actual mechanics of it, like, I was building as I went, and I went down a lot of like dark alleys that I then had to, backtrack out of. But part of this, there's this side plot, or sort of running flashback thread that goes through the book, that's Ahmad, in his life in the desert 1,000 years ago, being this, a very free-spirited genie, and he's pursued and captured eventually by a wizard, a desert wizard, a Bedouin, is like the nemesis. His nemesis, but he doesn't have any memory of this in 1899. But it's like through the book, it's like we're seeing the things that he's forgotten. And at the same time, I've already written from like the very beginning of the book, Joseph Schallman, who is the creator of the Golem of Hava, who builds her for this businessman, this sort of disreputable man who wants to move to America, and he wants a wife, and no woman will have him, so he has a golem built for him, like you do. And so I'd written Schallman, and I'd written this wizard whose name was Ibn Malik, and I at one point was just sort of like going over, doing sort of like a surface level edit, and I realized that I had described them both using exactly the same physical description. And I was like, well, no, I can't have, they're both very tall and they're thin and, with like this deep voice and, this like sort of skull-like face. They're, very old men. And I was like, well, Helene, you described them like they're the same guy. And then it was like, it just clicked. They're the same guy. And I remember I was in my apartment. We were living in Oakland at the time, and it was like, I think I scared the cats, because I started walking around the kitchen table talking to myself, like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? Okay, what if blah, 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 blah. And so it was, one of my better idea days, I think. But then I had to figure out, okay, what does that look like from a plot perspective? How do you build that into the book? How many things are going to have to change in order to make this happen? But it felt so right that it was that it just sort of had to be. And then I had to, come up with the idea of, okay, well, why is he constantly being reborn? What if it was like this, this thing that he had done when he put, have something to do with the fact that he'd imprisoned this genie, he'd bound himself to this genie and then imprisoned him, and then he's in the flask for 1,000 years, and maybe that means that he can't die. And, so I built this whole thing and then just sort of reverse engineered it into the book.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Thank you. It took a long time.
So you literally kind of discovered it as you were writing. The writing took you to this realization.
Yeah, I don't recommend it as a writing practice, as a way to build a very large book with numerous threads, writing, figuring it out as you go. I mean, it's sort of crazy making. It's like, I don't know how many times I wrote that book.
But it worked out really well. And again, the concept was just super interesting. I don't know why it just really struck me. That part of the book was like, whoa. And that was just a really cool part.
I've had a number of people tell me that they have missed their subway stops or, bus stop or whatever because they hit that part of it. And as like this whole thing is unfolding with these past lives, like they look up and realize that they're like 3 stops later. And like, sorry. I mean, not sorry, but sorry.
Yeah, that's really cool. So how long did you take a break before you started on the Hidden Palace? And did you not want to do the Hidden Palace, or were you just too exhausted from the first one, or what happened?
Well, so the second book took just as long to write as the first. That is why there was 7 years between books, was because it just, 8 years, I guess. Yeah, 8 years from published date to published date. I started writing it, I don't know, immediately, but within certainly 6 to 9 months of publishing the first one. And I wanted to write a sequel because I thought that would be easier. Spoiler, it was not. When I started writing the second book, I had a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, or 9 months, I guess. And life looked a lot different. And I had to learn how to be a parent and write at the same time, which is something that I am still figuring out. It's sort of a day by day, when does the writing get done? When does the parenting get done? When does, everything else that goes along with both of those get done? And sort of protecting my career from my family and the other way around. It's all this continual work in progress. But I was really bad at it back then. And I kept doing this thing where I would come up with an idea and then immediately jump in without thinking about, again, like down the road, what is this going to look like? And that's fine when you have all day to write, and you can write yourself in and out of any number of blind alleys. But it was sort of hellish when it was like I felt like I had to cram every single minute of my non-parenting life with writing, but then I was being so myopic about like, write this particular scene. Well, what is the purpose of the scene? What's the scene doing? Why, what does it feed into the overall plot? I just wrote and wrote and wrote without a very good direction, and I ended up tossing just a ton of stuff. And eventually so I knew that it was going to be a sequel. I knew that I wanted Chava and Ahmad to sort of reach the next phase in their relationship. At the end of the first book, it's a implied that they're going to go on and become more than like the friends / allies that they have become by the end of the first book. They're going to attempt a romantic relationship of some sort, whatever that looks like, whatever that can possibly look like for them. And these are two characters who I built to be pretty much polar opposites in their outlook and in their feelings for humanity and for the idea of like, existing within a larger community and culture. That Chava is very, her nature makes her servant, and so she wants to help others, and she's very drawn to the people around her, even though she has to keep some amount of distance to keep from being discovered. Ahmad, on the other hand, is very free-spirited, and he chafes at the idea of community and being beholden to others in some way. And they just, they constantly argue about that. So part of what I was going to figure out for the second book was, okay, what you get these two in a room and they start arguing. What does a relationship look like when it's these two together? If, the only thing that's keeping them together is this overarching knowledge that each of them, that they are the only ones who know what they're going through, that they are hiding together, essentially. And they are both looking at humanity from a distance. And that is the thing that binds them together. And is that strong enough to keep them together? If, or are they just going to hurt each other?
A question, since your background is Jewishness and Judaism, have people from your community read the book, the original Golem and the Jinni, and were they like, I don't know, did the Golem idea bother them or the mysticism bother them?
No, not as far. I mean, okay, I got like one review that basically took me to task for not being enough of a theologian for them. And I was like, yeah, I'm not a theologian. I'm a fiction writer. That is what I do for a living. But the book was really connected with a lot of Jewish book groups and a lot readers who either were into, sort of the Jewish historical fiction, but weren't sure about this whole fantasy thing, or fantasy readers who weren't sure about this historical fiction thing. So it ended up being a crossover book, but in sort of there were some hesitant populations that, had to be, I think some of them, it was like, yeah, it's a little too slow and thinky for me. I want more, like fantasy plot, and put it down. But a lot of the Jewish readers were sort of coming new to the idea of, rooting for a character who wasn't human. I got a number of, over the years, I've gotten a number of, I've never read a book like this before. I didn't think I could like a protagonist who was a monster, basically. And, I felt like, of all the compliments that I get, that's one of my favorites, that I've sort of opened up a world of, I didn't know that I could like a book like this. And that's just cool. That's just like being able to sort of transcend that boundary in that way. I get a lot of people like you, which is my other favorite compliment, which is I gave this to my kids to read, or I gave this to my dad to read, or, and that sort of intergenerational reading, because that's how I got into sci-fi, and from sci-fi fantasy, but was that my dad was a huge sci-fi fan. And he's the one who got me into, Star Trek and Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov. And, and that was like one of the things we talked about together. So knowing that that's something that other families are doing with my book is pretty awesome. But
good.
Yeah, but
go ahead.
Oh no, just answer your original question. I haven't gotten any angry emails or anything from people in the Jewish community, unless it's something they think I got wrong, like a fact or something.
Okay.
So pretty cool.
Well, I know there is some Jewish mysticism. I don't think it's about making golems, but there's the Kabbalah, the Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm.
So have you ever studied that stuff? Curious about studying what mysticism there is in Judaism?
I am curious about it. I haven't really studied it. It's sort of like a surface level. Some of it doesn't lend itself to narrative form in the same way that, one thing that Christianity has over a lot of religions is there is the story of a guy's life. And that, the life of Jesus is a very good story. And so you can get a lot of good, specifically religious, specifically Christian, fiction that, follows that, Bible stories. They are all, I guess I shouldn't limit that to Jesus, because there's any number of good stories in the Bible and the Torah, and, that many writers have taken and transformed into fiction, but they are all narrative tales. The thing about Kabbalah, from, what little I've actually looked at it and understood, is that it is very, very thinky. It is very conceptual. And so it becomes like, okay, but what do you do with that in a book of fiction with a beginning, middle, and end? And it would have to be a lot deep. I would have to get a lot deeper into it than that it would have to be like a huge research subject. And so what I did was I kept it more to the surface. Like some of it's like folk. I keep the magic a little fuzzy. There's a lot of like Jewish folk magic going back, looking at, some of the medieval texts, that it's sort of like any religion where they've taken what was in it's a mishmash of the folk legends, religious stories, there's some creature out in the woods. Well, what is it? And that sort of thing where it's about, well, you take things like you if you want to make a demon disappear, you have to say this name of God, and there's any number of names of God, and it's all that sort of, not numerology, but I forget what the term is for it, where it's letters instead of numbers, where it's like the 17-letter name of God. You have to say it, and then you'd say it again, and you take a letter off, and then you take the next letter off, and then it's like as the name of God dwindles, then the demon will dwindle as well until it disappears. And so I use some of the simpler, less heady magic sort of descriptions of that stuff. And I kept the rest of it a bit fuzzy because I just didn't want to go down that road where then I had to, basically, I didn't want to have to get a Jewish studies, PhD in order to write a book of fiction. So, I mean, it's like research, and you can just spend the rest of your life doing this stuff. And
that makes sense.
Yeah, I would love to spend the rest of my life researching this stuff. If I could make a living just, sitting and reading, I would love to become, just one of these Renaissance people who know a little bit about everything, or a lot about everything, but it's not the best way to write a book in the end.
So, I haven't finished The Hidden Palace, but, we will in the next month or two. But what's next for you now in your career? We're getting close to the end of the time here, but yeah, what's next?
So what's next is book number 3, and writing the outline. This time I am determined that I am going to take a longer time to figure out all the problems ahead of time, which means that I've been working on the outline for a very long time now. But I'm hoping that the process will still be shorter in the long run if I can, and I say this full well knowing that, things come up when you're writing the book. And then, for whatever reason, something that I, will have planned for years will on the page completely fall apart, and I will have to refigure it. But the hope is that if I've, nailed down all at least identified all the problems ahead of time, I will be, I'll have a better idea of what it is that I'll be changing when I do change something. But
when's Sony Pictures going to be contacting you to put this into the movies?
Wouldn't that be nice?
Should. It's a great story.
It's been optioned a number of times. Nothing has come of it yet. That's the way this goes. 9 times out of 10 is someone buys the rights and then they sit on the shelf for a couple of years till the contract runs out and they say, sorry, it wasn't the right time or whatever. But, I'm perfectly happy to take a small check and have the rights be sold and just sort of, it isn't anything that I'm planning for, but it would be awesome if it did happen.
Yeah, would you ever consider making it into having someone adapt it into a play that let's say students could put on? Or
I think that would be very cool. I think a musical would be awesome. I think there's a number of different venues or directions that something like this could go. Everyone says to me, so when's the Netflix series? And I'm like,
oh, maybe not that, but I think a movie would be great for this. But again, play.
Yeah. At this point, I'm sort of like, as long as it's done well, I am willing to watch anything that is made from this.
So what does your partner Kareem think of all this? Is he like super proud of you, or is he like amazed? What does he think?
He's very proud of me. And, he's also unfortunately married to a writer, so that, it causes issues sometimes. I work from home and I don't want to be talked to. And, I have my headphones on and I just sort of glower at people as they try to, start a conversation with me. But, and then he says, so how's work going? And how's the writing? And I'm like, I don't want to talk about it. And he's like, okay. So, that part's less than fun, but I think he's very proud of me and I'm very proud of him. He's a physicist. So, we've got the art and the sciences represented in the family.
Well, very cool. Well, Helene, it was really awesome to talk to you and interview you and, get to know you a little bit. And thanks for coming. So, the books are available everywhere. People can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or They can get the audio versions, as I understand. Like,
Yes.
Where are they available?
They are available anywhere books are sold, whether that's online or my favorite, which is independent bookstores. You can get the audio pretty much anywhere too, I think, whether that's, Audible or Libro FM, your local library. Yeah, they are out and available. And you can reach me online at helenewecker.com.
Very good. Helene, again, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a great call.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.